to begin by declaring unabashedly and unapologetically that I am an American. I've been asked to share my own story, yet another one, especially as how Mr. Henry's words had much to do with giving me the strength and the courage to continue on through the despair and the gloom, the anger, which occurred after that day. I was scheduled to do the public audience with the Founding Father here in the gardens of the Governor's Palace, 10:35 on that Tuesday morning. Beautiful day. Somewhere between shaving and showering, I heard about a little incident that took place with a small plane, no doubt by accident, which had flown into a tower in New York City. By the time I was walking out the door, of course, the real truth was known. It was no accident. And the second tower had also been attacked. In the car on the way here, on the radio, I heard about the Pentagon. When I got here to work, I first reported right here, right next door to the Roscoe Coal House. I had not seen a human being, at least to speak to, all that morning. First one was one of my very good friends and colleagues, Chris Allen. An American, naturalized, was born an Englishman. And he very cheerfully, as he always does, greeted me. Good morning, asked me how I was doing. I said, I'm not doing very well. You obviously haven't heard. I was the first to tell him of what had happened that morning. I was the one who spoiled his day. Shortly later, in the West Advance building in the Governor's Palace, one of my colleagues, I believe it was Claudia Jakovic, was sitting there with earphones and a radio and was listening to the news. It's when we heard about Pennsylvania, and that's when I also heard about the collapse of the first tower. And then it was showtime. I don't remember getting outside, really, but I was wending my way through the garden, passing through all these people who had gathered to hear me, Patrick Henry, speak about the American crisis of 1774. And as I looked at them, as I passed them, I noticed that they were all cheerful and smiling. They hadn't heard, I finally realized. They were on vacation. They got up early, they went out to breakfast, they hit the streets. So now you can see my dilemma. Do I tell them there's not going to be a show today, folks? In fact, you might want to think about going home. At least calling your relations, making sure that they're okay. A terrible thing has happened, and it's not over necessarily. We don't know. And Williamsburg might even be one of its targets. Why not? A place where America was created in the first place. Or I could tell them about what Patrick Henry said in 1774 with regard to the crisis at hand back then facing our founding fathers. I opted for the latter. It wasn't my place to tell them this, and furthermore, they'd find out soon enough. And so as I began to speak, as we always do, using the actual words of our particular character, I became increasingly amazed at how relevant Mr. Henry's thoughts and words were. Such things as, there is a foreign power endeavoring to deprive us of that precious jewel of liberty, to impose their will upon us. He knew, of course, just as Mr. Freiling had mentioned, that we've got to remain a united people. And the way he effected this, and very effectively too, was the first day of the Grand Congress, when they were all gathered together. These men from different parts of the continent who didn't know each other, they'd never met. Different, so different, night and day different. It was awkward. And finally, because the bickering and the squabbling began, Mr. Henry raised some eyebrows when he stood up and announced, "All America is now thrown into one great mass. All distinctions are now thrown down. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders is no more. I am not a Virginian, but I am an American." These were bold words for a subject to King George in 1774, but no more appropriate words could have been uttered that day than 9/11/01. I have become increasingly frustrated over the last 10 years that great unity, the fact that we saw flags flying everywhere for a couple of months at least after the event, You don't see so many of them anymore, except maybe special occasions like this. And once again, Americans are now defining themselves using hyphens. Italian American, Jewish American, African American, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat. I am an American. Amen. Unabashedly and unapologetically, no hyphen. The knowledge of that American unity continued with Mr. Henry throughout the rest of his life. In fact, the last speech that he ever made, shortly before his death in 1799, he invoked the motto of the First Congress, at which he and George Washington had both served together. United we stand, divided we fall. Let us not split into factions, which must destroy that union upon which our existence hangs. Let us preserve our strength and not lose it in civil commotions. Let's do that too. We can do that. Americans, unabashed, unapologetic. Finally, and I reference this only because Mr. Freiling mentioned it too, about Flight 93, let's roll. I'm rather confident that Mr. Henry never uttered those words exactly. But the sentiment, more times than we can even count, different ways, most notably, no doubt, his most celebrated oration in Richmond Town. I have a personal connection to that story too, because one of the men that Mr. Freiling mentioned, I found out months later, was a fraternity brother of mine. He was one of those who heard Todd Beamer say, let's roll. I can tell you this, and you'll never be able to shake my firm commitment or faith in this idea. But whereas Mr. Henry didn't say, let's roll, I know he was right there standing side by side, in spirit anyway, with those boys. And he was proud and he was smiling. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Let's roll!